Welcome to Build Your Thing, the podcast where we help content creators find their unique creative voice, monetize their work, and build their tribe of loyal fans. I'm your host, Matt Giaro, and when it comes to creating content, we all want to maximize our creative output. But is there a way to make our creative output easier? Is there a way to become more efficient? Well, you bet. Today, Srinivas Rao joins me on this podcast, and Srini is the host of the Unmistakable Creative podcast that you probably already know, and the creator of Maximize Your Output with MEM. He's interviewed more than 1,000 people and published 4 books, and he's certainly someone who knows a lot about how to be more productive when it comes to creating content. And with that being said, welcome Srini to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, congrats on those 1,000 plus interviews on your amazing podcast.
Thanks. Well, that's about 13 years of work in the making. So
yeah, so I'm probably 943 interviews away to reach your milestone. So there are definitely things that I can learn from you, but we'll keep this for another call. So Srini, you are creating a lot of content recently about building your second brain in MEM, and this is why I wanted to chat with you so that you can share your approach with the audience, how you're using MEM, how you're using your second brain in order to create more content. But before that, could you tell us a little bit more about you and what you're actually doing besides, talking about building a second brain in MEM?
Yeah, I think it probably helps to have the background as to why the whole second brain in MEM was kind of just something I took to so quickly. So, as you mentioned before, I have, hosted the Unmistakable Creative podcast where I've interviewed about 1,000 people. And, the byproduct of that work, I also wrote 4 books, 2 with a publisher, 2 self-published. And so the nature of my work involves processing and, synthesizing just large volumes of information, probably much larger than the average person. So just to give you, a bit of context, I read about 3 books a week. Usually 1 is for an interview with an upcoming podcast guest, and maybe 2 are just out of personal interest. And on top of that, I write a newsletter every week. I publish a video every week. And as you mentioned, we publish 2 episodes every week. So, it's a large volume of content production that's combined with a large volume of content consumption. So as you might imagine, it's a large volume of information to deal with. On top of that, I have ADD. So, I'm very easily distracted, and, distractions derail me much more than the average person. Like if I'm in a zone and somebody takes me out of it, the whole day just goes to hell. And so when I saw MEM, I really liked this idea of the distraction-free workspace. Notion was sort of my first foray into it. And I don't even remember how I kind of went down this rabbit hole. I just happened to be doing some Google searches on knowledge management or something like that. And, I stumbled up on Nat Eliason's Rome course. And I thought, this is kind of, something I'm curious about. And then I found that, Sanke Arendt's interview on how to take smart notes. And, when he mentioned Nicholas Luhmann had written 50 books and published 500 papers and got a PhD in here, I thought as a writer, I was just intrigued by, why this system was so effective and what made it work. And I also, could relate to this idea that, I have to this day still probably thousands and thousands of things I've written in Notion that just kind of never saw the light of day because I would free write, and there's no way to connect one idea to another or work in sort of intermediate packets, which is what Tiago Forte calls these little notes that we put together. And so I took Nat Eliason's Rome course, but I couldn't really grasp the user interface of Rome. It didn't make a lot of intuitive sense to me. And so conceptually, I loved it because I thought, okay, you know what, this is great. As somebody who has tons and tons of book notes and all sorts of stuff. But that's when, I discovered MEM. And for me, the idea that I could really, truly finally have a system that gave me, access to all of my knowledge at my fingertips without having to go to more than one place. Literally all of it is there. The only reason something isn't accessible to me in MEM is because I haven't put it there. And that's about the only thing that gets me out of it. And I probably spent 80% of my day inside of MEM at this point. Uh, and so that was what drove it. It was just, this idea that, wait a minute, I have so much knowledge. So this is the joke always, right? I always tell people, if I could actually implement the advice that I've gotten from 1,000 podcast guests, I'd be a billionaire with six-pack abs and a harem of supermodels. Obviously, I'm none of those three things. So I thought, okay, well, what would it take to get to the point where I really could start putting this advice into action? And also, use the things that I learn in my podcast and the notes that I take, the notes from the books I read. Like, how could I use that in creating my own content? So what I realized, and this is kind of the title of one of the first emails that people get when they sign up for our free Smart Notes course, is that collecting quotes leads to useless notes. And I thought about that because I thought, like, I have hundreds and hundreds of notes from books where I've just copied and pasted and highlighted quotes, and this is standard. This doesn't mean it's wrong. Something's wrong with somebody because they do this. It's just the way that they kind of were taught to take notes. So you look at the way that people study in college, they just highlight the entire textbook and then they go to an exam and then they wonder why they don't understand anything. And so I realized there's like a difference between consumption and understanding and consumption and true learning. And, obviously these are just insights I'm having as a byproduct of going through this process of learning how to use MEM. And so bit by bit, I just started to kind of tinker with it. Then I read Sanka Aaron's book, How to Take Smart Notes. And I think the thing that is, really difficult to grasp for people in a self-organizing space like MEM is that it's truly self-organizing, that you literally don't need to do any organizing. But the real value of something like that becomes a bit challenging to see until you accumulate a critical mass of knowledge. And usually that's around 50 or so notes. And it's not just, random meeting notes or things like that, but, sort of just ideas that are semi-flushed out, like maybe, 2 or 3 sentences. Then what starts to happen right around that point is you start to see this ability to make connections between your ideas and put things together in pieces. So it's kind of like a puzzle that you can put together in any way that you want. Actually, a better metaphor is probably Lego blocks, because typically when you get a Lego set and it's like, okay, this is what the thing is supposed to look like, right? You have just this one thing you can build. But there's another Lego set called the Lego architecture set, and it just comes with all these blocks of different forms and shapes, and you can build anything. And so that really, I think, is what MEM is like. It's like a digital Lego set with your knowledge in which you can create all sorts of things. And coincidentally, just about, I think it was probably earlier this summer, Tiago Forte published his book, Building a Second Brain. And I had been familiar with Tiago because he'd been a guest on our podcast. And, in fact, I'm the one who introduced him to my literary agent who made that book deal happen. And I jokingly said, I was like, yeah, that was purely for selfish reasons. I just wanted you to write the book so you could write it for me. But the truth is that he really did. He took the concepts that he talks about and he just took it to another level in that book. I mean, up until about a year ago, the book that I most frequently gifted was the bullet journal. And I told Tiago, I was like, you know what, I'm going to give 2 books to people now as a gift when they get started with anything. And it's going to be the bullet journal and your book, because the 2 together really are just wonderful. And so, Tiago did such a great job articulating it. So I took notes on the book as I'd been, taught how to take notes from the Sanka Aaron's book. And so I just started I just started implementing every one by one. I just went and implemented every single idea in Tiago Forte's book in MEM. And out of that, you get this idea of building a second brain in MEM, in which you have your projects, you have your resources. But here's what is so different is that, in most traditional note-taking apps or tools, you are forced to organize information in hierarchies. So what do we mean by that? Folders are a perfect example of this, where, if you think about the way folders are organized, right? You have to, you put things into folders, subfolders, and files. Now, the problem that comes with that is that even if you set up the sort of perfect second brain system with projects, areas, resources, all that stuff, you have to actively manage that whole thing. So it's like a digital closet that you're always trying to keep clean and keep from getting cluttered. And then you also have to remember where everything is. So the amount of effort that goes into, as one of my clients said, managing the systems that manage your information is almost as much effort as putting that information to use, which makes absolutely no sense because that's not what the purpose of all this information is. The reason that we have all this knowledge, the reason that we want all this knowledge at our fingertips is to use it, not to spend time managing and organizing it. And I think that that was really where MEM just kind of, shine. And then, because it was new and, a lot of people hadn't done a lot with it, I just kind of tinkered a lot. And it's always just kind of a work in progress of, okay, how do I do this? And just conducting little experiments to see what I can do, building little automations. Ideally, I've told, Dennis, the founder of MEM, I'm like, my goal is to get to sort of universal MEM, like where that is literally the only thing I use for pretty much 100% of the day. There's just a few things that it can't do yet. Like, I think right now, if it could export content to WordPress, then I think, or a blogging platform, I would pretty much be set. Like, that would be and if I could send emails from MEM, then I would pretty much, and I've gotten close to that, to be able to send emails to MEM. The receiving emails, it's a, clunky workaround, but it kind of works. So, that's it in a nutshell. I mean, it really came down to the fact that I just wanted to have a more effective way to not just manage large volumes of information, but put it to use. Because I have all these podcast transcripts, and so it's now what it effectively does is speed up the production process for content dramatically.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So if we can go back a little bit, so I've stumbled across this whole idea of Zettelkasten and linking your notes, standardizing, and like all the different concepts that I've been talking for in my free course too. The thing is that what like you mentioned that previously you were actually uh, um, putting all your notes into Notion, and before that, did you use any other note-taking app? Because like if I go back on my note-taking journey, like I just started, I guess, as a lot of people in Evernote, and then I just saw that, well, like this thing just doesn't work and it's just too slow, and
Well,
I'm just not able
yeah,
to.
I used Evernote. I didn't really, but I mean, I had Evernote. I never used it. Then I tried Ryan Holiday's note card system, but my handwriting is atrocious, so that didn't really work for me. And I just didn't have the discipline to follow through on it. And I never looked at the index cards again. So when I was introduced to the idea of Second Brain, I thought, okay, you know what, this is a framework that I can really kind of get my head around. And I like the fact that Tiago had it in digital form, and then I learned enough from Natalie Leeson's course that just kind of made things. It sped up my note taking process too. By using apps like Readwise to capture notes from books and things like that. And connect Kindle imports and stuff like that, because I primarily read physical books. Like I really don't like Kindle books that much. I just find that I don't synthesize, I don't retain what I read. So yeah, I mean, so I think that part of it was just evolution, but I think the thing that when I landed on MEM, it was just like, okay, this is great. But I think the big thing that drew me to MEM, like I said, was the fact that it was it really reduced this sort of hyperactive hive mind workflow that Cal Newport talks about in A World Without Email, where it's just like, oh, I have to, look in a folder to find this. I have to look in another place. And even in Notion, it was just like, where the hell is this? And sometimes I couldn't find it. But, in MEM, I think it just, to be able to put everything together in one place really fast, like you can assemble, sort of the core concepts of a blog post in 5 minutes. I mean, my friend Gareth and I do this episode called the Creativity Hour of our podcast. We just pick a random topic. And at this point, I have something like 8,000 notes in MEM. So sometimes I don't have an idea for what we're going to do. And I just sift through the database. I'm like, oh, okay, here's an interesting concept. And I can put together an outline for an episode in less than a minute. And, sometimes while I'm talking to him, when we're doing a previous episode, he'll say something and I'm like, oh, that's basically the title for our next episode. And so I think this ability to keep making connections between your ideas is what really struck me. But what it also forced me to do is to just start to really understand why MEM is so powerful, because MEM allows you to organize information the way that you think. So let me expand on that, because that just is a vague way to describe that. So I mentioned earlier, folders are an example of hierarchies. Well, your brain is not a hierarchy. Your brain is a network of thoughts, ideas, insights, memories. And, if you think of anything, right? I notice you have an accent. So if I say the name of your native country, immediately you have hundreds and hundreds of memories that you associate. You have hundreds of ideas that you associate. And that recall is instant. There's no effort for that recall. It's just like, oh, yeah, I'll give you an example. If you say the word prom, right? Anybody can say, okay, cool. So the thing is that you say the word prom, and then all the things that you associate with prom are nodes in the network in your brain, and those are all connected to other networks. So they're all associated with each other. And so what happens in MEM is it mirrors that process where everything is connected, everything is associated. The difference being that you effectively are building this brain from scratch. So it's a bit like recreating your brain inside a digital tool, but it's a version of your brain that has amnesia, and your job is to restore its memory by feeding it with information and data. And then, of course, as a byproduct of that, you'll also make new memories and new insights. And so the result eventually is that you just have this massive collection of knowledge. And so that's the thing. Like, part of why MEM looks the way it does when I use it is because I have so much knowledge inside of there that I've captured. This is 18 months worth of work. So there's probably about 8,000 notes in there at this point. So if you think about that, imagine just having 10,000 different nuggets of knowledge at your fingertips on virtually any topic that you've read about, studied about in your own words. Like, just, how quickly can you assemble things and put things together? That, I think, is really its power, is you just have, one, it's networked, and two, you can retrieve things with zero friction. So you add those things together, and suddenly you get this very, very powerful tool. And this is why I say, like, if you really think about it, MEM isn't a personal knowledge management tool. It's a personal knowledge generation tool. And nobody wants to manage knowledge. We want to generate knowledge. Like, we have to manage knowledge in order to generate it. That's just a precursor. It's like a prerequisite if we want to create content, we want to do anything. So yeah, knowledge management is the prerequisite to knowledge generation. And see, I just said that to you. And if I'm, like, while we're talking, I can be like, oh, cool, that's an insight. I'm going to write that down, and now I can go back and expand on it.
Excuse me just for interrupting you, but I just wrote it down as you were talking about it. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, literally, I'm just like, oh, okay, cool. Like, now I was trying to find the words to say what I wanted to say. And so now it doesn't even matter. Like, now that I've said it, I have this note in MEM, and I can just go back, and anytime I can just randomly search just for that word knowledge. Even if I forget to fill in the note, I can just go back and find it very easily. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. So I've also been, let's say, drawn into this Zettelkasten and linking the nodes, because it's just like mimicking how our brain actually works, right? As you mentioned, we are not like working in folders and subcategories and all that kind of stuff. So that makes perfect sense. But what I saw in your on your YouTube channel, obviously we're going to link to the YouTube channel in the in the show notes, is that you're still using kind of the para hierarchy. So can you walk us a little bit behind, like, the thought process behind using para, and why not, leave your notes like without any kind of hierarchy? Don't know if my question is clear. But
yeah. Okay. So para and MEM works really differently than I think it does in any other note-taking app. Because you're right. Like, so I think para, in a lot of ways, in MEM, para is a way of thinking about how to organize information than a necessity, right? So in like a Dropbox folder, an Evernote, and a hierarchy-based tool, you have to organize it that way. In MEM, it just kind of helps you have things in categories and find them faster and connect them faster. So, for example, if you have, a category called book notes, you just click on your book note tag, and then you suddenly have all of it. So I think that that's where the parastructure comes into MEM. So the thing I say in MEM is that tags become replacements for folders. And so as a result, you don't need to put anything in folders, and so you spend less time organizing and managing. You just add the tag and continue with whatever you're doing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you're more like using the para approach for tagging, and I also saw that you are adding some, let's say, some status related to a specific node. Let's say if it's when it comes to prioritizing your tasks and the things that you're working on. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, perfect. Can you tell us a little bit more about like your? I know that you have like an interesting free writing routine, and how does actually your free writing routine ties into your creative process? And are you able to use your free writing to actually produce content, or is it more kind of a routine that you use just to flush things out?
Well, so free writing has actually changed a bit as a byproduct of MEM. So part of the Smart Notes process is now, instead of aiming for the 1,000 words a day, I just often will process 5 to 6 notes a day. And in that process, I will start to come up with ideas for new blog posts. So that way, when I start a new blog post, it's just the process is a lot faster. So I'm less and less concerned with hitting a word count as much as I am in expanding, my knowledge based on the ideas that I've learned. But that being said, the free writing process was, absolutely instrumental to where I got to now. I mean, I still do write every day, but it's hard to even articulate it as sort of, hey, I just follow this 1,000 word routine, because at a certain point, what I realized was that, the 1,000 word a day thing was great because it gives you a target. It's clear. There's no question as to whether you hit it. It's a completely objective goal, but it can also kind of become a handicap because you can just go through the motions without actually improving, and really thinking about how to clarify your ideas and how to write more concisely, and be more concrete in your arguments. So that's part of why I took to the Zettelkasten, because it was like, oh, this forces you to really elaborate on what you've learned. So I'll give you an example of this, and this is when I come back to when people ask me about this. So I was an econ major in college at Berkeley, and I got piss poor grades. I mean, I graduated at like less than a C minus average from Berkeley, and the thing that struck me was when I went and kind of looked back at how I learned how to study, which was not how you should study, and that was that you go through this process. And because the thing is that the way that you're taught to study, that form of studying get you straight A's in high school. I got straight A's in high school, and I realized it was like being a straight A student in high school doesn't, is not an indication of intelligence. It's an indication of discipline. Any idiot can get straight A's in high school. So the thing is that when you get to college, what happens is you will learn something, like in an economics class. You'll learn concepts, you'll do problem sets. And, what people do typically is they go through the motions of doing the problem sets. They underline and highlight concepts. They memorize core ideas. And the problem with that is that when you get to, say, an exam, then what will happen is you will see that concept presented in a context that you've never seen before. And so what happens is that then you really have to demonstrate that you understood. And of course, if all you're doing is going through the motions, you don't actually understand. You've just gone through the motions. And so thinking about that kind of changed the way that I started writing. So I spent a lot of time flushing out notes and, just really kind of elaborating on those. But then when I am ready to sit down and write, I now have just such an abundance of research already done that the process of actually writing happens really fast. So I can like lay out the basic concepts for 3,000 word blog post in 5 minutes, and then I can write a shitty version of that article in probably an hour.
Okay, that's very interesting. And how do you approach the energy management when it comes to like everyone who's been practicing, really working on their notes rather than just saving information into their note taking apps. So do you experience, let's say, any fatigue when it comes to
Yeah.
having to process your notes every day,
Yeah, of
like?
course. So I think this takes us back to a lot of basic productivity strategies, that center around sort of flow and attention management. What I find is that there's a diminishing return on your attention throughout the day. And it really depends. Now, this is not set in stone for me because I'm a morning person.
Mhm.
Like you got me in an interview at what would have been 6 a.m. my time. And that was probably why it was such a struggle to get me on, booked for you, because I really don't like morning meetings. Mornings are, sort of my prime time, but you're in another country. So I was like, all right, fine, I'll do this. And, because we have different times of day. So I think the thing to do is you really want to optimize your schedule based on your biorhythms and
Mhm.
when you're most likely to be at your peak. And we're all at different, at our peak at different times. Like there are people who are night owls; they do their best work late at night. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes I'll sit down with a glass of wine at 6 o'clock in the evening and just hammer out notes for 30 minutes, and sometimes from that I'll get some of my best ideas because I'm semi drunk. But then I wake up in the morning, I'm like, okay, that wasn't such a bright idea after all. But I typically think it just tends to be based on kind of what your optimal rhythms are.
Mhm. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And when it comes to your routine, like, are you approaching, let's say, working on your notes, like as you mentioned previously, like every day you just have, let's say, a specific milestone that you want to
Yeah, so
reach?
this is a good question. It's funny because I'm about to do a video on this today. So
Perfect.
this workflow has gotten refined more and more with time. So typically, what I will do. We go back to the smart notes just for people who are listening who don't know what the sort of basic structure of smart notes. So you have four core types of notes inside this system, right? You have what are called your fleeting notes. And fleeting notes are basically just sort of a one sentence, a couple words reminder of something you read, and it's like on this page it says this. And then from your fleeting notes, you create literature notes. Your fleeting notes just get tossed, like they don't ever make it into the system. And so your literature notes are going to be your version of that concept where you write, you give it a title, you write the idea out in your own words, you say what page number it is on, and then you do that. So what I will do typically is, I'll read, maybe 80 to 100 pages every day. I'll write down my fleeting notes, maybe 5 or 6 of them in a notebook. And then I just create 6 or 7 blank fleeting notes, or I basically create, 5 or 6 blank literature notes, and I just add them to my inbox in Mem. So that way they're in the inbox. Like, I think the inbox is one of Mem's most underutilized features. It took me a while to understand why it was so useful, because the inbox is actually probably one of the best prioritization tools in Mem, because I think the thing that can happen is when you're scrolling through your timeline and you see all these different things, you can get distracted. Ironically, within a system that's distraction free, but the inbox kind of narrows your focus to just a handful of things. So when I have 5, 6, 7 things in my inbox, I know that's it. Like, this is all I'm going to work on today. And even talking to you about this is making me think about it, even more so. So I was talking to Julian Smith, who's mentoring me, and he was talking about sort of this attention, effort, and disproportionate value funnel, right? So you look at sort of the things that you give your attention to, and you say, okay, like, which out of the things that I give my attention to, which ones produce the most disproportionate value, or for the effort, where do I get the most reward? Because it's always going to be disproportionate. It's not linear. And the funny thing about that is then you start to realize that the number of tasks you complete in a day is a really shitty way to measure your productivity, because it's not a measure of effectiveness. It's just a measure of crossing items off a list, because not all tasks are created equal. And so when you sort of say, okay, I'm going to work on these 2 or 3 things that have the potential for huge impact. I'll give you just a personal example because I wrote about it the other day. So a couple of years ago, PodFund, the venture fund that invested in podcasters, including ours, they made this announcement that they were going to invest, do $50,000 seed rounds in a couple of emerging creators. And that day, somebody told me about the application, and I remember looking in the Podcaster Movement Facebook group. And there, everybody was basically discussing what they would do with $50,000 or how they would use $50,000. I went and filled out an application. So you think about that, right? The time that it takes to fill out the application, maybe it takes, an hour to dick around on Facebook. And the output is what? You have a couple of comments on Facebook and some pointless, stupid discussion. Now, maybe it takes 3 to 5 hours to fill out the application to gather all the materials. And what's the outcome? $50,000 in seed funding. So that's the way you kind of think about it. And so that's kind of the processing approach that I take now is okay, I have these, 5 notes, and I'm like, I'm going to take these 5 notes, and these are the things that I'm going to work on today as far as notes go. And when I'm done with those 5 notes, I'm done with smart notes for that day. And what's crazy is how quickly this adds up. And when you're taking these literature notes, inevitably you're going to have ideas of your own, and you just add bidirectional links to those literature notes, then those become permanent notes. And so basically, the inbox honestly is where a lot of my work in Mem happens. In fact, I do most of my work, I'm realizing just from talking to you, in the inbox, and that's how I should manage everything. As the inbox really becomes your to-do list for the day.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And like you mentioned that you're taking a lot of that you're reading a lot of physical books. So I'm curious, like about your workflow. How do you manage that? So since everything
Yeah,
goes
yeah.
into your inbox, like are you rewriting, let's say, the
Okay,
excerpts that you
so
find interesting?
yeah, so that's exactly what I'm doing. So what I will do is I will underline or highlight a passage in the book. Then when I write down sort of the one sentence reminder of what that passage was about, I put it in a physical notebook, and then I go into MEM and I create a literature note based on that idea, and I just add it to the inbox. So, for example, I might have 5 notes that I wrote down in the notebook. I add those 5 notes to MEM. Then I go in and I just add 5 notes to the MEM inbox, and then I start the work on processing the notes.
Awesome. Srini, like I really appreciate your time. I don't want to take a bigger toll on your time and on your peak hours. Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up this call?
No, I mean, I think that, so we have a free course called Maximize Your Output, or How to Take Smart Notes. You can learn more about it at maximizeyouroutput.com/smartnotes. I'll send you a link for that. But yeah, no, other than that, you can check out our MEM tutorials on our channel, and then we have the Maximize Your Output with MEM course.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Srini. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and hope to catch up soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, so hope that you've enjoyed this episode with Srinivas Rao. As always, I'm going to leave all the links in the show notes below, so you're going to find Srini's tutorials about MEM, but also his online course. And I'm also going to leave a link to my free email course to improve your note-taking. It's a 7-day free email course, so feel free to check that out too. Thank you very much for tuning in, and talk soon.